The police thought they had just arrested another eccentric old man from out of town. But when the FBI showed up 30 minutes later, everything changed. This wasn't just a story about a man in uniform. This was a story about assumptions, silence, and the high price of underestimating someone who's lived more than he's ever said. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching this video from. And don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow we've got something even more special coming your way. It had just started to rain when Sylvester Stallone turned onto the narrow 2-lane stretch of Route 9 that ran through Willow Creek, a quiet town tucked among the Northern California hills. The streets were nearly deserted, bathed in the dull orange glow of old street lamps, the kind of place where folks still left their doors unlocked and waved at anyone who looked like they belonged. Stallone didn't look like he belonged that night, not in what he was wearing. He had just wrapped a late shoot on an indie thriller being filmed 6 miles west of town near an abandoned Cold War-era military base. The film, a low-profile project called Dead Man's Protocol, centered on a retired covert operative who resurfaces to deliver forgotten intelligence to the government after decades underground. It was a passion project, one he had taken on for almost no pay, just because the story meant something to him. The shoot had run long that night. Stallone, still in full costume, decided to drive himself back to the base camp rather than wait for the production shuttle. He wore a weathered military field jacket, plain black cargo pants, and scuffed combat boots that had seen real action, not just the kind on sound stages. His face was half hidden beneath an old army cap and a pair of dark aviator sunglasses. In the passenger seat sat a real military-grade briefcase used in the film, complete with biometric locks and a heavy-duty design that made it look like it could hold launch codes or radioactive material. In reality, it held a flash drive, some fake documents, and a few vintage photos, meant to stir up backstory for a long-lost platoon. All properties, all fiction, except no one at the checkpoint knew that. The flashing lights appeared up ahead. A DUI stop manned by the local law enforcement. Normally, it would have been a quick breathalyzer and a flashlight inspection, but Stallone's arrival threw everything off. The young officer who approached the vehicle wasn't a movie buff. He didn't recognize the man behind the wheel, only saw the serious face, the silence, and the ominous-looking case on the seat. When asked for ID, Stallone, still halfway in character and half thinking this might be part of the production, handed over a fake federal ID created by the film's prop department. It bore his real name, the insignia of a defunct agency, and a clearance level marked in red ink, Level 4, Ember Division. It looked real, too real. The officer asked what was in the case. Stallone, in his gravelly tone, replied, "That's not something you want to open, son." No smile, no explanation, just enough to raise every red flag. Within 10 minutes, Stallone was standing outside in the rain, hands behind his back, as another deputy cuffed him. He didn't resist, he didn't explain, and he didn't break character. He still thought someone on set had orchestrated this. Maybe it was a hidden camera stunt. Maybe a method acting drill taken too far. But when they loaded him into the back of the patrol car and drove off without calling his producer, he began to realize this wasn't a joke. Back at the Willow Creek Police Department, they processed him like anyone else. Desk Sergeant Ed Ramirez glanced at the ID, looked at the man in front of him, and did a double take. "Is this guy for real?" he muttered. "Looks like Rambo's uncle." Stallone was booked, fingerprinted, and placed in a holding cell. The case was tagged and locked in a steel evidence locker. No one dared open it. The biometric scanner on the front blinked red when touched. When one officer joked that it might be nuclear, another quietly stepped back. There was something about the man's presence that made them uneasy. It wasn't just the uniform or the silence. It was the way he was silent. How certain he seemed, like he'd done this before. Meanwhile, at the front desk, a clerk entered his name into the system and hit enter. The screen blinked, then froze, then went black. A red message appeared. Not a warrant, not a criminal alert, just a phrase: "Do not proceed. Federal review requested." Code: Ember. The clerk read it twice, then picked up the phone and called their supervisor. 20 minutes later, the landline rang. This time, it was someone from a restricted federal line. The voice was calm, precise. A woman. "This is Special Agent Rachel Linscott with the FBI. You are holding a man named Sylvester Stallone. He is not to be arrested. He is not to be questioned. Secure both him and the object in his possession. We are en route. ETA 30 minutes. And just like that, the entire room shifted. The officers who had been cracking jokes now stood a little straighter. The sergeant looked again at the ID. "You're telling me we just arrested Sylvester Stallone? By accident?" No one answered. Someone reviewed the body cam footage. It was him, the voice, the walk, the eyes. Yet none of them could figure out why a man like that was driving alone through their sleepy town, dressed like a ghost from 1975, carrying a briefcase no one wanted to touch. In the holding cell, Stallone sat on the edge of the bench, elbows on knees, hands clasped, just waiting. He wasn't angry. He wasn't confused. If anything, he looked like a man watching the last 10 minutes of a movie he already knew the ending to. Outside, the rain had softened to a light drizzle. Inside, no one said much. Someone offered him coffee. He nodded, thanked them, took it black. He didn't ask when he'd be released. He didn't ask if they knew who he was. He just waited. Every few minutes, he glanced at the door, not impatiently, just deliberately, as if he could feel them coming, and they did. The sound of tires slicing through wet asphalt broke the heavy silence that had settled over the Willow Creek Sheriff's Department. The deputy at the front window, a rookie named Daniel Moore, leaned closer to the glass, his breath fogging the surface slightly as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. 6 identical black SUVs, no lights, no markings, pulled into the lot in a clean, deliberate formation, engines humming with a sound that didn't quite match their size. The vehicles didn't idle. They parked. Doors opened in near-perfect synchronicity. Men and women in tailored dark suits stepped out, each wearing small earpieces, some holding tablet devices or thin leather portfolios. There were no introductions at the door, no questions asked, only a quick flash of badges to the sergeant who had walked out to meet them, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. The woman in charge introduced herself with the sort of calm that made people quiet, without realizing why. "Agent Rachel Linscott, FBI. We're here for the individual you have in custody. Where is he now?" Sergeant Ramirez, who had held 1,000 people in that little station over 30 years and never once second-guessed his authority, suddenly felt like a guest in his own office. "Holding room," he answered, voice low. "He's been quiet, hasn't said much of anything. Claimed what he was carrying was classified. We thought, well, we didn't know." Linscott didn't respond. She nodded once and walked past him without another word. flanked by two agents who moved with practiced alertness. Inside, the station had gone still. Even the usual buzz from the dispatch radios seemed to muffle itself as the agents passed. Officers who'd been sharing quiet jokes earlier now leaned on door frames or sat rigidly at desks, watching as federal authority overtook their small-town order. In the holding room, Stallone sat just as they'd left him, leaning forward slightly, eyes steady, no sign of agitation or confusion. When the door opened, he looked up but didn't rise. Agent Linscott entered alone, closed the door behind her, and stood for a moment studying him. "Mr. Stallone?" she said, her tone professional but not cold. "I apologize for the inconvenience. It wasn't supposed to go this way." Stallone gave a slow nod, then smiled faintly, voice dry. "Wasn't my first bad take." Linscott let out the barest exhale of amusement, then added, "You're free to go, but we'll need the case." At that, Stallone stood. "Of course, I was delivering it. Still am. Just didn't expect the stopover." She nodded and opened the door. The agents outside fell into step as they led him not back into a cell or interrogation room, but to the conference room, normally used for community meetings and department briefings. The sergeant followed hesitantly, still unsure if he was allowed to speak. Once inside, the room felt like a different world, lit differently, quieter, heavier somehow. Stallone took a seat at the long wooden table, and within moments the locked briefcase was carried in by one of the federal techs. They placed it gently in front of him. He looked at it for a long moment, then removed his glove and placed his thumb on the scanner. A soft green light blinked. The latch released with a muted click. Inside was not what anyone unfamiliar with classified government work would expect. There were no weapons, no cash, no blueprints for something sinister. Instead, there were documents, some printed, some handwritten, tucked into worn folders, bearing government seals long since outdated. There were photographs, some faded, some in color, most clearly from the 1980s. Men in uniforms, places that looked like overseas airfields, grainy images of coded transmissions. In the corner of the case sat a small black device about the size of a deck of cards, its surface scuffed, the serial number barely legible. Stallone didn't touch it. Agent Linscott did. She put on gloves, lifted it with both hands, and examined it closely before nodding to her team. "This is part of Ember Watch," she said, finally turning to the officers who had begun quietly gathering at the back of the room. "A program buried in the late 80s. Joint agency intel sharing across military and domestic lines, mostly Cold War ghost work. It was terminated in 1990 after a compromise. No records, no witnesses. Just one physical archive remained." She looked at Stallone, then added, "He was trusted to hold it until a new clearance protocol was activated. That protocol went live last month." Sergeant Ramirez spoke for the first time in almost 15 minutes. "So he really was delivering it? This wasn't part of something else?" Linscott turned toward him with the kind of stare that managed to be both sharp and respectful. "He's not under arrest. He's a federal asset. And tonight, he completed a promise made decades ago. One we couldn't track, because that's how it was designed." Someone at the back of the room whispered, "But he's an actor." Linscott replied without missing a beat, "He is, and a veteran, and a man who once trained with us in a completely different context. Sometimes roles overlap in ways people don't understand." Stallone simply sat, watching the faces in the room absorb a truth they hadn't prepared for. After the files were documented and sealed again, Linscott asked Stallone if he wanted an escort back to his camp. He declined. "I think I've had enough attention for one night," he said, standing. She smiled slightly and nodded. "Understood." He paused, then looked around the room one last time. The rookie deputy, Moore, who had been the one to initially cuff him, met his gaze nervously. Stallone walked over, extended a hand, and said, "No hard feelings. You did what you thought was right. That's more than I can say for a lot of people." The young man shook it, visibly relieved. After that, Stallone was led to the front door, where the drizzle had turned into a soft, steady rain again. The SUVs waited, dark and quiet, and as he stepped outside, the weight of the night seemed to lift a little. Inside the station, no one spoke for a while. There was no laughter, no murmuring, just a kind of collective reflection. They hadn't just arrested a celebrity. They'd stumbled across a story that didn't fit into the boxes they were trained to check. The kind of story that only made sense in silence. Agent Linscott returned to Sergeant Ramirez and handed him a sealed envelope. "This contains a contact number and a brief acknowledgement from the Bureau. For your records only. It doesn't go into your system." He took it wordlessly, and she added, "Your people acted professionally. We're not here to reprimand, just to recover what was never supposed to be lost." And with that, the agents filed out, one by one, vanishing into the mist like they'd never been there. Back at the filming camp, Stallone drove his Jeep onto the gravel with little fanfare. The crew had mostly packed in for the night. Only the line producer and the head of security were still there, both looking relieved and sheepish. "We tried to call the station," one of them said, "but they didn't take us seriously." Stallone just chuckled. "They did their job, and I did mine." Then he walked to his trailer, peeled off the soaked costume jacket, and poured himself a stiff shot of bourbon. As he sat down on the small couch, the rain tapped gently on the roof, and he let the quiet settle. The story he carried was no longer his to hold, and that, in its own quiet way, was freedom. The morning after, the town of Willow Creek stirred slowly to life, unaware of the strange weight that still lingered like morning fog above the rooftops. The coffee shop on Main Street, always first to open, clinked with the sounds of ceramic mugs and quiet conversation. Sheriff Ramirez sat in his usual seat near the window, a paper cup in hand, the sealed envelope from the FBI still tucked inside his coat pocket. He hadn't slept much. The events of the previous night looped in his mind, like a film he hadn't finished watching. Across from him sat Deputy Moore, face paler than usual, eyes tired. He was still going over every detail, every decision, trying to make sense of how he could have possibly mistaken one of America's most recognizable faces for a suspicious threat. "He didn't even flinch," Moore muttered. "Not once. You'd think someone in his shoes, celebrity or not, would have said something, called a lawyer, asked for a manager. But he just waited." Ramirez nodded slowly, staring out the window as the sun pushed gently through the clouds. Sometimes people who've lived through enough know there's no point in arguing with people doing their job. Moore looked down. "I still feel like an idiot." "Good," Ramirez said. "Means you'll pay more attention next time. And you'll remember something most people don't get until too late. Sometimes the quiet ones are the ones who matter most." 2 hours later, Stallone returned, not with cameras or press or any attempt to clear his name. He drove the same old Jeep into the station lot, stepped out dressed in jeans and a dark flannel shirt, and walked in like any ordinary man, dropping off a lost wallet. He asked for the sergeant. Ramirez, who had just returned from patrol, greeted him at the front with a look of both relief and embarrassment. "Didn't expect to see you again," he said. "Thought you'd be halfway to L.A. by now." Stallone smiled faintly. "Didn't want to leave without thanking you. And your men. It wasn't a great night, but you handled it better than most would have." Ramirez opened his mouth to respond, then thought better of it. He simply nodded. "We were just doing our jobs. But thank you." Stallone reached into his coat and pulled out a plain manila envelope. "Thought you might want this for your wall." Inside was a signed photo from the set of Dead Man's Protocol, Stallone still in costume, holding the briefcase with the misty foothills of Northern California in the background. Across the bottom, scrawled in black marker, "To Willow Creek PD for a hell of a supporting role. Sincerely, SS Ramirez." Couldn't help but chuckle. "Mind if I show the guys?" "Show whoever you want," Stallone said. "Just maybe leave out the part where I spent the night in holding." As he turned to go, Moore stepped forward from behind the desk. "Mr. Stallone," he said, voice firmer this time, "I wanted to say I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disrespect you or treat you like—" Stallone cut him off with a gentle wave. "You were doing your job, and you did it right. You asked questions, followed protocol. That's more than I can say for a lot of people who wear a badge." Moore stood taller after that. The look in his eyes shifted from shame to something closer to pride. When Stallone left the station, the air felt lighter. The rain was gone, the roads drying under the growing sun. But the town, in its own quiet way, had changed. In the following days, word spread, not through official reports or news headlines, but through whispers at the diner, at the hardware store, over fences and church pews. People asked why the FBI had shown up at the station in black SUVs, why the cameras from the gas station caught a Hollywood legend stepping out of a sheriff's office like he'd just renewed his driver's license. Some believed it was a scene from a film. Others thought it was a mistake. A few, especially the older veterans in town, recognized the way Stallone carried himself that night. The way he stood still when others panicked. The way he said little, but meant more, with his silence, than most could with a microphone. For them, it wasn't about fame. It was about recognition. Not of a movie star, but of a man who knew things few others did, and had learned long ago that some things are best left unsaid. Back at the set, production resumed like nothing had happened. The director shook his head when he found out what went down, muttering something about over-designed props and method actors. But Stallone didn't bring it up. He didn't tell the crew, didn't ask for retakes, didn't demand special treatment. He simply stepped back into the role like he'd never left, finished the film, and left the hills of Willow Creek just as quietly as he'd arrived. The studio would later market Dead Man's Protocol as a film inspired by real events, which was half true, if not entirely the right half. When the movie finally premiered, it made modest waves in the press. Critics praised Stallone's performance as subdued, haunting, and emotionally layered. They said he brought something raw to the screen, something that felt like memory, not acting. None of them knew just how close they were to the truth. 6 weeks later, a small package arrived at the sheriff's office, addressed by hand to the men and women of Willow Creek PD. Inside was a DVD copy of the film, a handwritten note from Stallone, and one more photograph. The entire department standing stiff, and awkward in front of the station, with Stallone in the center, grinning like a man who'd seen enough to laugh at everything. The photo was framed and placed on the wall just above the booking desk. It didn't have a plaque, didn't need one. People who came in asked about it. Some got the story, most didn't, but it hung there anyway. A quiet reminder that not everything is what it seems. And Stallone? He didn't talk about the incident in interviews, didn't write about it in his memoirs. He returned to his life, his family, his next project. But sometimes, when he passed through a small town, he'd slow down a little at the side of a sheriff's cruiser, tip his hat, and think about a rainy night in a quiet California town where the past met the present in the shape of an old metal case and a young deputy who asked the right questions. Because in the end, it wasn't about the arrest or the briefcase or even the film. It was about something quieter, something deeper, a promise kept, even if the people keeping it never knew why it mattered. And for a man like Stallone, that was enough. He didn't need applause. He didn't need headlines. He just needed to know that someone, somewhere, still understood what it meant to wait, to carry a message, and to deliver it to the right hands, no matter how long it took. And as long as someone listened, even once, it was worth it.